guys, sorry about that. I'm gonna get back to where we need to be here. Should be this. Okay. I'm gonna start at that one. This is where we kind of dropped off. We talked about high cultures and low cultures. We're going to start right there. Okay. Okay, so we talked about the study of personal space, just to review real quick. And it can be terms of the intimacy of personal space preferred by members. Okay, overall, of course, you know, some people are different than others. You know, some people love to have people really close to them, and others kind of want a little bit of space. And then, of course, it can stem from different concepts of the personal person, right? Individual. Okay, so here's our discussion. The textbook stated that there are always significant variations with any given culture. Okay, what do you think causes these variations?
I mean, in America, like you're saying, it kind of depends on like where you're from, and there's a lot of different cultures in the country, and even like at my house, we're more like used to like personal space, and when I come here, and other people aren't as used to it, so I think it might depend on your family and like what they like. Because for me, I just was like used to like sitting like next to someone instead of like right next to them.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely a family thing, I think. My family is they're European. They're from European roots. I'm French and I'm Polish. And those roots definitely are there. They're not very huggy or any of that. And I mean, they will if we haven't seen each other in a very long time. And that's it. Like, my parents didn't on a normal basis hug me or any of that. But when my dad remarried, now my step family, they are very demonstrative. So my uncles would kiss me on the face and things like that, which was I felt very uncomfortable. I still do when they do that, even though I don't see them very often. But I think in some ways that was good because it kind of taught me about that it's okay, you know, it's okay to get hugged and it kind of prepared me too for my husband's family who are from the South. And they are very huggy. They give each other a hug every single day. Like when they see each other, when they say goodbye. It's like, even if they just saw each other, you know, earlier that day, it's just how they are. And that's a good thing. And I think it is like where they're from and then of course their roots. So I think that's part of it. And I think too, when we have so many different cultures within the United States, like we said, Hispanic families, a lot of times, you know, they have that closeness of a family. They will definitely be more intimate. So what are your own personal space rules? Think of how these play out in public places, conversations with friends, and conversations with just acquaintances.
Well, I think it's kind of interesting because I think that it's changing a little as I'm here. Because before it's like, I mean, I was okay giving people hugs and that kind of stuff, but I didn't really do it a lot. But then here, like, everyone does it, so I'm just like, okay, well, I'm like used to it now.
Yeah.
So, I think it's kind of like changing.
Yeah. How do you think you'll be as you get older with your own family, when you have your own kids and that kind of thing? How do you think that will take place?
I think I'll probably like be more like touching and stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, I always like gave my parents hugs, but it was like no one else.
Right.
Kind of.
Right. Yep. I think that was true of me too when I moved out here and went to school, because it was definitely more you know, especially living with a whole bunch of girls, it was
Mhm.
definitely a little bit more, people would give each other hugs and stuff. And I think that helped. I think that helped kind of like get me from the, you know, we were a little bit more physical in that sense. And then when I would see a friend, we'd give each other a hug or something like that. And then, I think that helped when I got married because when I had kids, I started to notice the flaws with some of the way I was raised, with not being as demonstrative as we could be. And so, even though in some ways it makes me a little uncomfortable, I know that that's not necessarily good. So I think when you see some of the things that may not be as, like, I need to be more more loving. And even though it may not be as, you know, some people are just like, that's their strong suit. For me, it's a challenge, I'll be honest. So, I mean, I do love my children, it's not that I don't love them, but to physically show that, I like to show it in service. That's my gifting. But to do physical touch, that's not my gifting. So, because I know that, I purposely show them through touch. So, like, I will cuddle with them, and I will hug on them. My daughter's a teenager now, so she doesn't really like that stuff anymore. So, I'll play with her hair, rub her back, something like that. And my oldest, of course, he's a boy, he really doesn't like it. So, I'll give them a fist bump or something, just to let them know that I see them and I love them. And I tell them a lot more than my parents told me. I make sure they know I'm proud of them and that I care about them. And I think those types of ways have changed. Like you said, you kind of change over time because part of it is you growing up, and as I've matured and grown as a mother even, that's changed too over time. And that's good, I think. All right, think of examples of differences in style that you have experienced in terms of personal space. Were they cross-cultural, or some times that maybe you felt uncomfortable, or you felt, different or something?
Well, in Mexico, like, they all get, like, hugs and stuff, and the ladies will, like, give you, like, kisses on the cheeks or something. It doesn't make me, like, that uncomfortable, but, like, a little bit. But
Yeah.
I am, like, used to it when I go there now, because I've been going since I was a kid.
Yeah.
So it helps.
Do you remember the first time you went? Do you remember how you
I was,
felt?
like, 5.
You're 5,
so
so probably
not
not.
really. I do remember, like, when I was a kid, they'd, like, pull your cheeks. I
Oh,
didn't
yeah.
like that.
You're like, no.
But I think here I see a lot of different, like, terms of personal space too. Just like more like sitting, hanging out or something. Like some people are like right up there with you.
Yeah.
And it's just different.
Yeah, it is. Some people like to be right in each other's space. And some of that is because their family was so close. And if they were home a lot, like if they were homeschooled, for instance, and they did everything together as a family, they tend to be really very close. But if they weren't, or if their family, like if they're missionary kids and they were here in the States and their parents weren't here, or vice, whatever that might look like, sometimes that's, they might not be as close either. Okay, so how might personal space play out for some of your students in an ESL classroom in the US? So if you had students, or like in your case maybe a business here in the US, how would this personal space maybe play out? So for instance, in a business meeting here in the US, what would you do?
I think it would be interesting to try to figure out what's like normal for them, like what the right context would be for them, and just be aware of that if it's different than us, so you don't get like offended. And also be like, oh, America.
Yeah, and I think you have to plan it out too, when you think about, okay, so I'm gonna have these teams of people working together. So I have an Asian young man and a Hispanic lady working together, right? Along with another Hispanic gentleman or something. All right, how is personal space gonna be a problem when they're working in this small environment or whatever? How are we going to work on that? Or all of these people are going to be at this table, how are they going to feel about that? Or, maybe just thinking it through, taking the time to address that. Now, how might you need to be mindful of personal space if you work abroad? Because if you want to start a business overseas, for instance, how is that gonna look?
I think I would try to need to remember what's common there and try to adapt to it even if it didn't feel like the most comfortable.
Yeah. So for instance, when you would have people come into the business, if they're a culture that kisses on the cheek, you'll have to do that. You'll have to get used to doing that. Or if they bow, you'll have to get used to doing that and not looking them in the eye. If they kneel and show honor to someone who is older or of a higher office, you'll have to do that too. You know, I mean, there's all different cultural things. So you'll have to study the culture in order to best meet their need. And that will show not only respect for them, but that will let them know that you honor their culture, which will help them more likely want to do business with you. Sometimes what I notice, even with like politics and stuff, I watch like how our presidents in the past have interacted with other cultures, and they don't always try to go the extra length to honor those cultures. They just are like, well, we're American, this is how we are, so this is how we're going to greet you. We're going to shake hands. Now, thankfully, there's a lot of cultures that understand that about us, but I think it would be nice if we would go the extra mile and be like, okay, so I'm meeting with the French president, let's greet them the way they want to be greeted. Or, you know, if we're going to meet with the Chinese president, then let's, you know, greet him properly. Or, you know, I think showing that would go a long way with, you know, diplomacy. That's just my thoughts, but I don't think we tend to do that very well. Okay, so the rules change in public places. Okay, so when we're outside, when we're waiting for a train or a bus, what are contexts in which your normal personal rules are broken, but it's okay? When you're out, you know, when you're out in public. What do you think that it's okay?
I mean, sometimes you're like crowded in a crowd.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
well,
Like, I mean, besides right now with COVID-19, everyone's 6, you know, feet apart. If you're like at an amusement park and you're waiting in line and you're like right up against the person in front of you because you got squished, right? And someone pushes you from behind you, bang into the person in front of you. I hate that when that happens, but it happens, you know, and you feel bad. And what do we say? Oh, I'm so sorry, right? It wasn't your fault. He knows it's not your fault, but you just banged into them and you disrupted their personal space, right? And that's kind of, it's okay because you didn't mean to. Or if you're waiting at a restaurant and you're all squished in that little lobby area and we're awful close and they're strangers, right? Or if, for instance, my child sometimes, he's gotten into their personal space, I'll apologize, won't we? That's kind of what we do. We apologize for it. We'll say, oh, I'm so sorry, right? Or if we get too close, let's say we're walking in front of somebody right at the grocery store. They're looking on the shelf, but we had to walk kind of in front of them. We say, excuse me. Why do we do that?
it's just kind of like courtesy.
Yeah, because they're looking and we just interrupted that space where they could see. It's the right thing to do. And we even teach our children that. Say, excuse me, don't be rude, right? A lot of cultures don't do that, but that's what we do because we value that space. And sometimes we don't really have a choice but to kind of interrupt that space, but we always either say sorry or excuse me. Okay, so what are your proxemics rules at the restaurant table?
Well, I mean, I feel like it's just kind of like this, like sitting not that close, but like
Yeah.
together.
Yeah, so my husband likes to sit at the end of the table if he can, or at least at like if we have these chairs here, he'd want to sit toward that, not in the middle. The reason why is because he's, bigger than me, and he doesn't want to be banging someone's elbow. That's that space, okay? Whereas I don't care if I'm in the middle, doesn't bother me, because I don't eat like that, I kind of see it like this. But when you're a guy, your shoulders are broader, you know, that kind of thing. And so some people want to make sure they have a little bit of room for elbows, so they're not banging the person next to them. What are your proxemics rules for your house or your dorm room?
At our house, it's kind of like you all have your own space. Like if you're sitting on the couch, like it's important to us that we all have our own seat. We don't like sit close.
Yeah, you don't share a seat.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and when you do have to, people complain about it,
Yeah.
right? Even my youngest, my 6-year-old, will be like, why, right? I want to sit here, right?
And if it's gonna be like shared with anyone, it's like mom or dad.
Yes, yeah.
Not the same.
Yeah, even like, you know, I have a couch that will sit 3 people, but usually it'll be 2 people because you want that space in between, which is really interesting. We want still more space. We don't usually like to sit 3 people, and if we do sit 3 people because we have guests over, it's for a limited amount of time because you can only handle it for so long. Because it still makes you uncomfortable even though you're family, because you feel like, okay, I can't really move much because it's just this much room. It's interesting. You can't be. It's not like comfortable enough to like watch a whole show or watch a movie because you want to kind of relax, and you can't because it's like here. That's it. That's as much room as I have. I think too when you I was trying to think if you have like I don't mind having Will, my youngest, on my lap and stuff, but he's still like in that space. So I'll do it for a little bit. But I can do, it's not because I don't want to hold him, but because he's in my space and it's not comfortable. And we're really big, Americans are really big about comfort. I'll tell you something I think is really interesting. When you're in some of these third world countries, and I'm sure you probably saw this in Mexico, but in Uganda, they will shove as many people as possible in a bus or in a van or on a motorcycle. I've seen like 6 people on one motorcycle. Or on top of a truck, you'll see people just hanging almost off and stuff for transport, you know. And it used to crack me up, but they have space is not a big deal to them at all. And I've been on the bus where there's like, instead of 2 people on a seat, there's 4 of us. And I'm literally hanging off the edge. And this lady next to me was holding a live turkey on her lap. And I'm just sitting there kind of, I'm trying not to laugh because I'm just thinking if my family saw me, they would die. They would just die laughing right now. Because personal space is a big deal. And there's no such thing as personal space in Africa. You know, it's like it doesn't exist. But here we do value it so highly. So I think it is kind of funny when you think about it. All right, so we kind of talked about kinesthetics, but I did want to kind of look at a couple of things. Greeting routines. So let's look at Japan and Korea and then the US differences. This is something where they're talking about the president here. Oh, hold on. Oh no, I don't know if it'll play it. Hold on, pause it. This is why.
By Bill Gates, but it has caused him a world of hurt halfway around the world. He was greeting the president of South Korea when he inexplicably left his left hand in his pocket. It was immediately labeled rude and disrespectful in the South Korean media. Many pointed out a button jacket and a 2-handed handshake would have been the proper greeting for the South Korean president.
Huh. Isn't that interesting? You wouldn't think that that would be a big deal, but it obviously is. So do you think too much was made of this? I mean, obviously it was all over their newspapers. He was considered very rude for doing that because he had his hand in his pocket and he was shaking her hand, and also his jacket was buttoned. What do you think?
I think it's a little bit overkill just because they think that he didn't do anything wrong. But I guess maybe he should have been more prepared.
I think that, kind of like we were talking about on the break, that we need to, if Americans particularly would take the time, some of our diplomats, some of our politicians, in this case he's a businessman, would take the time to just study the culture in which they're going to work. Like he obviously is probably going to do some type of business thing. If they would just take the time to understand the culture, understand the greetings in this case, understand the faux pas that we can, do like that, this would not have been the problem. This wouldn't have been a problem. That is very simple. Don't put your hand in your pocket. Don't have your jacket buttoned. Maybe he could have thought about bowing or doing, the normal cultural thing for someone that is a higher position than him. Even though he is a billionaire, she's a president. You know what I mean? Like, let's show honor. And it probably would have went a long way and would have shown that he's humble, and if more of our diplomats would show that, I think that we would have a lot better viewpoint by different countries. But we're kind of viewed as proud and loud, and I think that could change very easily if we would just change our approach. And then the posture, we kind of talked a little bit about that earlier. All right, gestures. Gestures are an integral part of communication. Speakers use gestures daily, almost instinctively. We don't really think about it, whether to beckon someone, like, come here, right? Punctuate spoken discourse, like, I told you not to do that, right? We point fingers, which can be very rude in a lot of countries. You don't point. With my Asian students, I don't point. It's very, very rude. Or offer ritualized greetings. In the Italian culture, frequent and emphatic hand gestures are routine. They're very, when they talk with their hands all the time, right? It's just part of their speech. In fact, it reinforces, and sometimes it is their speech. Gestures that have acquired specific meanings are referred to as emblematic gestures. So these can be like a thumbs up sign, like, are you okay? We just do that. Or a head shake, like, no, yeah, okay. The two-fingered V sign, right? Peace, right? This one, what does this mean? Like, what does that mean? Like deuces, right? And so in different parts of the country it means something more. Like, I'm out, is what that means, right? And signals used to beckon someone, like, come here, you come here, right? A parent might do that. But for other people, that might mean something completely bad. And of course they, like we talked about, they can vary from each culture. They can be polite, it can be a friendly gesture, or it can be obscene. While speakers in one culture may learn to use only a verbal command like stop, speakers of another culture may learn that it's acceptable to hold an arm up in the air with the palm facing another person to indicate stop, like we do. Stop. Other people, though, they wouldn't know what that means at all. So let's take a minute and let's write down as many gesture things that we can think of, like the thumbs up. Write down as many as you can think of. I'll get my phone out. All right, you can start. 30 seconds left. Ten seconds. Okay, we can stop. Alright, so what were the ones that you
Yeah. I just put like thumbs up, waving, consent, raising your hand, nodding yes and nodding no, stopping your hand, come here gesture. And then I don't know what that is, just like the loser sign.
Oh yeah, loser. My youngest is a loser and he dances, you know, that little dance with I was like, that's not very nice. But yeah, those are all emblematic gestures. Illustrators, these enhance communication by reinforcing, illustrating, or accentuating communication. So these kind of are, here I'll give you an example. Members of certain cultures use a wider range. Italian speakers, for instance, are noted for their use of extensive hand gestures and are often described as talking with their hands. Members of Latin and Mediterranean cultures make more frequent use of illustrators than members of Asian cultures. So certain illustrators, like emblems, also convey different meanings. In Mexico and Ecuador, it is inappropriate to indicate a person's size using a hand gesture, like we would. My son is this tall, you know. We wouldn't do that. This type of gesture is used only for animals. So it's insulting to do that about humans. So illustrators would be more like an indicator of something. Okay, so like I caught a fish that was this big, or no, really it's this big, right? So can we think of something that would use this where it accents or substitutes or something where we are using a emblematic gesture like a thumbs up, but we're trying to accent something. So we're saying something's okay or something is great. How would we accent it with a gesture?
Like you said, like thumbs up and it's good.
So if we're accenting something that was like great or is good, and we really wanted to make it like it was awesome, what would we do?
I mean, I think if you were talking about like food or something, you could that's so good. I don't know.
Yeah, sometimes we will like, yeah, you can do something like it's so great, it's for showing our emotion, right? Where you hit your heart. Or you could do something like you're really excited, so you like fist pump in the air or something like that. Okay, if you're excited about something, like you heard some good news, you might jump up and down to show your excitement, again, in emotion. So to make something that's more like a compliment or an accent, we're going to show the emotion behind it versus just doing a thumbs up, which is kind of like you would do on Facebook or something, which is just thumbs up. Doesn't carry emotion, you just like it. But if you wanted it to go farther, then you're going to connect how much that means to you. Okay, so what are your habits for gestures? Do you usually use like both categories where you have the emblem, you know, like, yeah, I'm good, or you just nod your head? Or do you like really nod your head like, yes, I'm so excited? Okay, do you use both, or what do you use the most?
I think it depends on the context. I feel like if I'm like listening to someone and like a class or a sermon or something, it's like on my head,
Yeah.
chanting. It's probably more. Well, I feel like I don't, unless I'm like in a certain mood, I don't usually show like the really excited emotion. It has to
Yeah.
be a certain time.
Yeah, I would say I'm not a person that shows a lot of super emotion, but there are times that I have. It just does depend. It just depends. What about like at sporting events? Do you get really excited or?
Like I'll try to, if I'm like watching like a television or something like that,
Yeah.
to show support. But like it doesn't naturally come.
Yeah. Okay. What about like weddings or funerals or, you know, something that is an emotional event?
I don't think that I would get super like showy.
What about worship, like at church?
Maybe more that.
Yeah, more that.
Also, it depends on
Yeah.
how comfortable I am in the context.
Yeah.
If
I mean, I would
it's
say
a
that when I was younger, I didn't as much, but now I do raise my hand sometimes, and that's kind of based on your personality, I think, or at the moment, whatever the song is sometimes, or how you feel in the moment. But sometimes I would say I would use both depending on the situation, like you said. But he's asking more, or I'm asking more about the habits. So I think my habits for certain things, sometimes I do have emphasis with my fingers with my kids. I do. And usually it's out of exasperation. If it's been something that we have, like normally I don't do that if I'm just telling them something. But, because I'm pretty even keel. But when I get to the point of, okay, I've told you this enough and I'm frustrated, then I do that. And that's kind of how my husband is too. And that's out of emphasis usually. So I do have that. But I think that's probably my norm. If I say hi, sometimes I'll go like that, or sometimes I use my eyebrows, and once in a while I'll point with my chin. But besides that, I don't think I do a lot of anything. Okay, obsolescence. All right, we're not quite there, I didn't think. Okay, so this has to do with haptics. It's on bottom of page 162. Cultures differ in how they make use of and interpret touch behavior or haptics. Crucial variables influence haptics, including gender, age, and status of participants. The meaning of touch behavior varies from culture to culture as well, with subcultures. High contact cultures engage in more tactile behavior than do members of low culture. Latin Americans touch members of the same sex much more frequently than do Asians. To show confidence in the speaker, for instance, a speaker may grip the other speaker's upper arm, which is what I kind of told you about. In North America, women tend to touch more than men. In some African cultures, speakers will continue to hold each other's hand while talking. For Japanese, though, most touching behavior is unacceptable and avoided as unhygienic. So chronomics, the usage and importance of time vary significantly. Let me see where this obsolescence is. I think I got those out of order. Anyway, we'll get to that one. The usage and importance of time varies significantly among cultures. Cultures differ in how they structure, construe, and perceive time, which we kind of touched on this a couple weeks ago. So Native American tribes and African cultures emphasize present time. They don't really think about future. In fact, it's not really in their language, which is interesting. Languages reflect their culture, and so some languages don't even have a future tense. Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. A lot of them don't have it in their language. It's just present. They might have past, but they don't have future, which is really interesting. Some cultures, like the Chinese, place great emphasis on the past together with the present and the future. They regard time not like linear, like here's the past, present, future, but like it's all connected. So it's like it just kind of continues all together. And it kind of goes in a circular pattern. The cultures of the US and Canada, for example, are very new in terms of history. So these cultures prefer to focus on the present and to regard events that happened 100 years ago as really old. We do, right? But it's not. When you think of Chinese cultures, they're thousands of years old. And when you go to Europe and you see these buildings and things, you realize how young we are. I mean, those buildings have been there for thousands of years. I know when I went to Egypt and I saw the pyramids, I mean, they've been there since the days of the Exodus. And you just realize, oh my word. I'm looking at something that's like, centuries and centuries old. It's amazing. It kind of blows your mind when you think about how old it is compared to things here in the US. And I think it's old, I'm like, wow, I've seen things from the 1600s here in the US, which seems really old, because out here you don't see that very often. But I grew up in a part of the United States which is very old. I mean, the house I grew up in was way over 100 years old. And so I've seen things that are super old, but then I go over there and I'm like, oh, that's nothing compared to here, And it does blow your mind a little bit. And that kind of helps me realize, okay, these other cultures, when they focus on time, they understand it in a, especially Chinese culture, where their past defines who they are. And it is important to their culture. That's why they regard those who are older as wise, and they respect them and they honor them. It's because they honor time. They honor their past. So members of these types of cultures that time isn't their, most important thing, is more flexible. Appointments can be broken, things can be scheduled simultaneously, and time cannot and should not be compartmentalized. So these P-time cultures, time's not really, it's not that it's unimportant, it's just in different terms. So like among Arabs, the future will be as God wills. In fact, I don't know how many times I heard Africans say, I'll see you tomorrow if God wills, or I will be there if God wills. And I used to think that is the weirdest thing I've ever heard. I used to be like, what do you mean if God wills? You're either coming or you're not. I mean, I kind of understood, like, if God wills, like, well, yeah, if you don't die or something, but I thought it was really strange to say that they say it all the time. And that's what it means. It means, if I can, basically. It's their kind of like, get out card. Sometime I'll get there if I can. And that's what they mean by time. They don't use a planner. Like, if you look at my phone, it's full of all these things that we have, like, listed down. I have a planner for work. I have a list of a to-do list, and I'm sure you do too with schoolwork and all that. You have to, because the dates don't change. That's just how they are. And that's something that's hard to work with sometimes when you're from a different culture. Now, we're M-time people, which sometimes it can be negative for P-time people, because they look at us and think, okay, there was a word that they called white people there, they called us Mzungus, which means people who run around in circles. Sort of means. Which I thought was really hilarious, because really that's how they view us, and it's based on time. We're so busy doing this and this and this and this and this and this. They just kind of watch us and look at us like, why are you doing all that? Just have a cup of tea. Just sit and relax. Sit with us and have a long lunch. Take a nap. If you go to like Hispanic cultures, they have a whole long time for a nap, which in some ways is very good. It's good for your health. Take a rest every day. Wouldn't that be nice? And if you go to France, they only work 4 days a week, and they have a whole month off for vacation. They do that because they regard time differently. It's not, for us, we are ruled by time. The other way around, they rule time. It's a little different. It's because relationships are more important than being on time. Okay, silence. The role of silence, or the absence of talk in communication, also varies from culture to culture. In Northern European and North American culture, silence is viewed somewhat negatively. We expect some sort of immediate response to a suggestion or request. So when we ask something, we expect something. So for instance, my son, his room is down in the basement, and we'll call him and say, Josiah, nothing. Josiah, nothing. And then he'll be like, I answered you. No. We were waiting for your response. We actually listened. We heard nothing. We expect a response, right? That's how we are. So the absence of speech is actually considered rude. Initial silence is generally interpreted by them as a negative response. But in Asian and even some Native American cultures, they view silence as important and appropriate for social interaction. Speakers from these cultures often use some moments of silence before offering a response to another culture. So this is important to know for your students, for business. I actually, when I have my ESL classes, I use a lot of silence in my classes. Because one, if they are from a culture that needs that silence before they answer, it's good for them. It gives them the chance to think and then respond. If they're from a culture that doesn't like silence, it makes them uncomfortable, and then someone will answer. It's a good tool to have either way. Because when I have a mixture of students from different cultures, the Hispanic students won't like the quiet, and so one of them will answer. Even if they don't know, they will usually try to figure it out. Or my Asian students will take the time to think and find the answer. For me, it is uncomfortable because my nature is, okay, no one's answered, so I'm going to give them the answer, or I'm going to help them find the answer, or something, right? Because that's my innate. So I've had to learn to wait, and just wait, and just wait. I might ask the question again, but I'm going to wait, because eventually they will answer. So it gives them, it helps the listener, the teacher, to show that we respect them enough to wait for their answer. All right. So all of this, so all of this is called, yeah, that's what this is. All of this is called oculesics, which indicates the attention and interest of speakers. What you're doing is you're persuading them to be honest and respectful, even when in the silence. Because in Asian cultures, that's showing that you value their answer by waiting, okay? When you're waiting, it causes those who make them uncomfortable to value you, because they have to answer. And that you're willing to wait for it instead of just giving them the answer. Especially American students. If I have American students, you know that someone's going to say something, right? They'll be like, someone answer, because it makes them uncomfortable. Establishing, maintaining, and ending degrees of intimacy among speakers. So that can be a bit of a challenge as well, because we don't know what that space is, what kind of intimacy is between us or not there. So understanding that can be helpful. Regulating the sequencing and the participation of the speakers in a communicative situation. So when we figure out both the verbal and nonverbal communication and how we can regulate that, that's going to make your classroom a better place when you understand, okay, Asian students aren't going to necessarily look me in the eye. My European students will, my Arab students will, because they're going to show that confidence. My Hispanic students may not either. My African students won't either. Okay? That doesn't mean they're not listening. They're listening, but they're trying to show me honor. And the displaying and revealing of emotions. Students might not show the excitement that I'm feeling about this subject. So when I say things like, isn't that awesome? And they're just nothing. Whew, nothing. Not a smile, not a anything. They might look at me like, I don't understand why that's exciting, right? They might have a quizzical look, but that doesn't mean it's not exciting. They may not understand why you're excited. Why are you showing that emotion? We're just talking about writing, okay? They may not understand why you're showing emotion at all, because teachers don't show emotion in their culture, okay? Now that doesn't mean you can't be emotional, but maybe you need to show them why we get emotional and we're okay to show it. That's something we could talk about. Establishing, maintaining the power and status of the speakers. So minding them, showing them how that they need to look at you. They need to do these things if they're going to be in America. So explaining to them how a teacher is. So for instance, with my Asian students, because they struggle with asking questions, because in their cultures they're not supposed to. It's considered disrespectful. So they don't ask questions. So every time I'll say, do you understand? They'll go, do you have any questions? But I know they don't understand, and I know that they do have questions, but they won't ask. So I say in my classroom of students, this is our safe place. You can ask me anything, and it is not disrespectful. In fact, in America, we expect you to ask us questions. It's okay. So if you have a question, now's a good time. And then I might even go around the classroom, especially when they're getting to know me, and I might ask them, are you struggling in some area? I don't ask them in front of everybody, because that is dishonoring to them, and they feel ashamed. But as they get used to me, they'll start asking questions. And then I explain to them, you can ask questions to anybody. You can go to any of your teachers and ask questions, because in America, teachers expect you to ask questions. It's okay. It doesn't mean that you're dumb. It doesn't mean that, it doesn't make the teacher feel ashamed. It makes them feel like you're learning, which is different than your culture, and that's okay. And over time, they become responsible for their learning. And that's a hard thing for cultures that don't have that to understand. And that can be the same in your business meeting. They may not ask you questions, and then they make mistakes. So you need to encourage that type of collaboration. Is not big in a lot of countries. So teaching that about American way of doing business or American way of education is important. Conveying impressions of self to the speaker. Okay, so like we were talking about, what is it, your personal bubble, right? How do you express that type of frustration with another person, or that you are excited, or you understand, or you don't understand? All right, so, we talked about eye contact. What about, let's talk about this. What about in social settings when we're looking at eye contact? How does this change? What about when you're talking about someone who's much older, or let's say you were going to talk to Dr. Granados. How would that change with eye contact?
You'd be expected to look him in the eye if you were talking to him.
Yeah, he would expect you to look him in the eye to show confidence, to show that he's listening to you, right? And that you're listening to him. But how would it make you feel inside?
Probably a little bit like nervous.
Yeah, a little nervous. Why is that?
Just because I don't know, when you're talking to someone who's like has like an important role, you don't want to like mess up or like say something wrong.
Right.
And it makes you feel kind of like vulnerable.
It does. It does. When someone looks into your eyes, you feel vulnerable, right? You feel like, they might see my mistake, or they might see if I'm nervous, or if I'm not really listening, or if, I don't know, they just might see something and maybe, it just makes you nervous, right? And he is the president. Now, do you feel the same way when you're talking to a friend? No, why not?
Well, one, you're just more comfortable with it in general, so it doesn't bug you as much to be vulnerable with them, I guess.
Right. If you make a mistake with a friend, you guys can laugh it off, right? Usually that person, you have a history with them, right? So they know kind of how you are and they accept you. Whereas maybe with Dr. Granados, you haven't had that much time with him yet. So he doesn't know much about you. So you want to make a good impact, right? So it's different, and there's that age, and it's a gender thing as well. So you have all of that. We talked about this. What about touching for you? Okay, we talked about what it's like around cultures. But what about your personal rules with friends? We talked about how you've changed a little bit with hugging and things since you've been here. But what about in business? What do we do here for business? Shaking hands, yeah. And we're going to talk about this for just a minute, because this is important. It's something that I usually talk about with my students as well. Our culture has taken it even to another length, right? We have harassment issues. We talk about it in college, and then we talk about it in every workplace, sexual harassment, Title IX, right? That's important that we talk about those things, because they have to sign, they have to understand it. We've even had classes for my students that we discuss it a little bit deeper when I've taught college and adult learners, and we talk about it more in depth so they can understand that, because that's not something they have in a lot of cultures. They don't at least have those, they don't have Title IX, let's put it that way, in a lot of cultures. So explaining that that's not okay. Now, do they have issues like that in other cultures? I'm sure they do, right? We're humans. I'm sure they have those kinds of issues, but they may not have that legislation. So because of that, explaining that this type of behavior is not okay. If it happens at your workplace, these are your options. If it happens here at college, these are your options. It's very important because even if their culture is a huggy culture, it's not acceptable in the business place. That's considered wrong in our culture. And those kinds of things are important to bring up when you're teaching here in the US, or if you're a business person. That would be something you would have to cover with them. It would be very important because they also need to know some of the other types of exchanges that would be considered that way, like words or offers or those kinds of things, whether it was male or female or even male to male, any of that stuff they need to know, because that would be something that culturally they wouldn't understand. So we did, for instance, when I had my adult learners, we actually did scenarios because the wording is very hard. So we actually had, we did a couple of scenarios. We had a couple of students who talked it out, and then we had some translators so they could understand it. We didn't go into the long depth that some of the videos are because that's too much, but we did do some scenarios so they could understand what we were talking about. So that way it would help them both in the workplace and at college. All right, we talked about silence, so let's look at this one YouTube. So sometimes it's the pace of the conversation. For instance, I talk very fast. Part of that is from where I'm from. And my husband will tell me. Even last night we were talking. He's like, okay, stop. Too fast. One thing at a time. I don't realize I'm doing it. So he'll tell me, and so then I'll stop. And then I'll move on. And I tell my students too, if I'm talking too fast, just tell me. And then I'll stop, Pauses within conversation. When I teach ESL, I make sure that we stick, instead of going from like what we've gone through a lot. I would never have done this with ESL because it's too much. We might only talk about one of these things, but then we might talk about, like, for instance, eye contact. We might use it in many areas instead of just talking about all of the different ones, because it's way too much information for them to process through two different languages. It's a lot. And then the no verbal response at all. Sometimes they just need to think it out. So let's look at this one.
Silence is an important part of the language in Japan. Japan is a collectivistic society, where people do not just represent themselves, but also their family and cultural group. Japan is also a society with high power distance. Power refers to the vertical disparity between the participants in hierarchical structure. According to Jeff Launders and Joseph Rowland's definition, collectivism is a form of anthropomorphism. It attempts to see a group of individuals as having a single identity, similar to a person. Collectivism demands that the group be more important than the individual. It requires the individual to sacrifice himself for the alleged good of the group. The standard of good is that which benefits the group. Individuals are not recognized. They are merely a tool for the group. There are many examples in Japanese culture where silence expresses meaning with great force or subliminal elegance. This video will focus on silence in classrooms and in business meetings. A Western student may use silence to draw the listener in, to slow down the flow of events, or encourage the teacher to pay attention while the student justifies or explains. Most Western societies are individualistic societies, where people are independent and represent themselves. Seltman classified silence in Japanese classrooms into 4 categories. 1. Surprise silence. 2. Silence as an expression of agreement and disagreement. 3. Silence as an expression of defiance. And 4. Silence as an expression of femininity. Consider the following examples.
So students, as we know, last week we had 2-paper essay about styles of English writing. So Brian, you will take it. Okay.
Surprise silence happens when students are caught off guard, where they seldom respond to questions to avoid disturbing the harmony.
Do you all agree that Shakespeare was accurate in his descriptions of Macbeth?
Silence is an expression of agreement
That-
and disagreement. Using silence to suggest agreement or disagreement is common in many cultures. Clarification is made through accompanying body signs. Generally, agreement in Japan is expressed with nods of the head, as in the up and down of a yes.
We did that.
Disagreement
Real,
or other
it's
negative
very little,
acknowledgement
just a
is
little.
often accompanied with a nod to the side, towards the shoulder.
And by that, students, we conclude today's class. But I wanted to tell you now that we've got an exam next week, and that I'm not going to have office hours then. So if you have any questions or anything, email them to me by this week.
Yeah.
Silence
You
as
can
an
see
expression
this
of
one tonight.
defiance, to convey an explicit message. In Japan, it has become an accepted code of behavior to use eye contact only for important messages in the case of high power distance. In the first part of the example, the student avoided direct eye contact with the teacher due to the teacher's authority and higher level in the hierarchy and the respect the student had for his teacher. The second part of the example, the students looked directly at the teacher to recognize the important message that the teacher was conveying, which was, there is an exam.
So we've got components of a sentence which consist of a verb and a subject, and both are used to make the sentence more powerful and to make it have more of a sense. Do you get this now?
Silence is an expression of femininity, based on a common belief of an ideal Japanese woman. It is still a common belief in Japan that an ideal woman should speak softly and only when spoken to, with her head and eyes lowered in respect and modesty, especially in the company of men. Even if the professor is a female, the female student would not have a direct eye contact with her because of her status and therefore would remain silent.
I've seen that so
However,
many
the
times.
female student would interact normally with other female students because they are all considered to be equals. Now let us turn to the use of silence in business meetings.
This will be good for you.
We're thinking that we should buy use of powers to reduce conflict.
No response. You see how he's being quiet though?
I don't think it's a good idea.
1. There can be several reasons for the silence. If a suggestion has been made by the foreign CEO, the Japanese side may sit quietly pondering over it, and the foreign CEO should wait, not breaking the silence, even if it goes for several minutes. It is not a negative event, and they are usually carefully considering what has just been said and will respond when ready. A second possible reason for the delay is that everyone is waiting for their leader to say something, and in hierarchical Japan, they feel constrained to keep
Yeah.
quiet until he breaks the silence.
It's not a
The superior
collaboration.
person present
The
is
boss
the
is
only one who
will
can
talk.
initiate a conversation, and it would feel wrong for any other team member to start up.
That's why you have to help them become collaborative.
In
That's hard.
conclusion, it is a great thing to understand how people in other societies think or behave, so that in the future we would be aware of how they think and shape their lives in case we communicate with them. But we should always remember, using the right method of communication depends on the context. Understanding the reasons behind specific behaviors goes back to the kind of society that the individual belongs to, whether it is individualistic or collectivistic.
Okay. So I think it's kind of good to kind of see what it looks like, because it's hard for us to imagine if you haven't been in those classrooms. That's a really good video to kind of show what the silent classroom looks like when you're asking a question, because that is very much the case. And you'll kind of see them nod if they believe that. And I don't know if you caught the nonverbal behavior when he kind of shook his head no. You could tell he was frustrated. I caught it. He didn't like what he was saying, but he'd probably never tell that teacher why. If you ask him, okay, you disagree, why? So that would be what I would want to say, but that student would not agree. Now, what would be a way that you could maybe get that student to explain what his thoughts were?
Just ask him like his opinion on it.
You could, but you couldn't ask him in front of the class, right?
Yeah.
So that'd be shameful. He probably wouldn't answer. He'd probably be like, nothing. He probably wouldn't answer. So I would probably talk to him afterwards maybe and say, I'd like to hear your opinion of this. What did you think? Instead of saying, you said no, why? I would probably say, what were your thoughts about this? Or what did you think? Or you didn't, maybe just say, did you understand this? And he might say yes, and then say, what did you think, or something. Just try to see if he can maybe answer it without sounding like you're judging him or something, so it doesn't cause shame. That would be one thing. How would you make a classroom or a business office like this, when there's a boss, how could you make it more collaborative? Because they're not used to, a collective society like that isn't used to working together. They're individuals. Even though they're collective, they're more individualistic. How could you make that happen, since you're trying to make it more of an American type of business?
So like, if I was like the boss and they were under me,
Mm-hmm.
I think, I don't know, and I could just
Well, I guess like what he was. Remember, he was
like,
the outside CEO, right? So then you would be the American CEO coming over to their plant, right, their business, and you're coming to see how things are going. He was saying something about buying more tires or whatever, but they have a manager or a boss. And notice the other guy didn't say anything because he was letting his boss talk, which is understandable. I probably would have done the same thing. But how could you make it more collaborative where the other ones can say something?
maybe if you better to like talk to them more individually, because they might feel like they're being disrespectful for talking to other bosses there.
Right. So maybe taking the boss out of the picture in those meetings, or having them meet as a group, the employees meet together and have them have things to talk about as a group. If the boss is there in the meeting, then they're going to defer to him, which is showing honor. And that's the right thing to do. But if you could get them to meet together and discuss certain things, that might help. Or if they even, as individuals, like they like to do a survey and ask those questions and see if they respond. And then they can meet as a group and say, okay, these are some of the responses that you had as individuals about these products or whatever, or about the work atmosphere. Let's talk about it. And then maybe they would talk to you about it possibly. But then when we meet with the boss, this will be after the boss has read the responses and the thoughts. Then you could lead that with everybody. That might be a way of doing that to get things done versus just going to the boss and saying, okay, we need to have a more commitment or more whatever. Everyone else won't say anything, Okay, so nonverbal miscommunication issues are the hardest to correct in yourself and in your students because they're subconscious. We don't even realize we do it. And it's very difficult to be self-aware sometimes of our nonverbal cues. Remember that there are double standards for you as a foreigner and for your students as foreigners, okay? We can't help it. We just, we might be like, we're really loud and we're telling them to be quiet and we're the ones that are really loud. You know what I mean? So we have to be careful. Remember, there's a lot of different ways of having these nonverbal cues across cultures. So don't really worry about the rules. They're different for individuals as well. So even though it might be a society that doesn't touch, for instance, maybe they do as a family. Okay. Be careful with the Asia generalization. Not all Asian cultures or all Asian people do this. So just be careful about that as well. Okay. So this is going to be, I think, this is our last thing that we're going to look at. So take a few minutes. We're going to look at this together, and you're going to choose 2 of the above videos and comment on the nonverbal behavior. Give an example for each category, okay? So you're going to look at a couple of these. You're going to look at the haptics, the oscillesics, the chronemics, the proxemics, and the silence. So you can look at each one of these and do this, okay? And if you want, you can come up here and do this. I'll probably stop the video here so that way this is done.